Evening, everybody, and welcome to Strand. My name is Sabir, and I direct events here at Strand. For a little bit of history, Strand was founded in 1927 by the Bass family over on 4th Avenue's Book Row. Stretching from Union Square to Astor Place, Book Row gradually dwindled until, after over 91 years, Strand is the sole survivor, still run by the Bass family, and still housing new and used books. Tonight, we are incredibly excited to welcome Ian McEwan to discuss his brand new novel, Machines Like Me. Ian is the best-selling household name behind 17 books, including the novels Atonement, winner of the National Book Critics Circle Award and the W.H. Smith Literary Award, Amsterdam, winner of the Booker Prize, and The Child in Time, winner of the Whitebread Award, as well as several short story collections. Machines Like Me finds him turning his attention to the pressing questions of artificial intelligence and machine learning, even as he turns back the clock to the 1980s, albeit a 1980s in which Thatcher struggles to maintain power and Alan Turing is still alive. We're thrilled to have Ian here to discuss his new book with John Grisham, a fellow best-selling author of 32 novels, 1 work of nonfiction, a collection of stories, and 6 novels for young readers. So, without further ado, please join me in welcoming John Grisham and Ian McEwan to Strand.
Testing. It works.
Receiving.
Thank you, and thank you guys for being here. I just learned a moment ago that I'm supposed to be the moderator tonight. It's your book tour, and so I'm supposed to, I think, take charge of the conversation and talk about this book you've written. Does that sound okay? I mean,
Okay.
there's no format. Obviously, we're not prepared. We have no script, and we'll go off script right now. What we'll do is ramble for a few moments and talk about books and writing and the current book. And if we get bored, we'll just take. What now? We're in the wrong chairs.
It's okay, I'll switch mine. Yeah.
You can swap people.
No, it's all right. Sorry.
You're about to read my rights.
So sorry. Excuse
I got a
me.
lawyer here.
That looks like fun.
You just have to sit more that way, where I can see you.
Why does he have 2 mics?
Yeah, well,
Lapel and handheld.
this one's mine.
Oh.
You want one too?
No, I don't want to. One's enough.
Do I need this as well?
Yeah, well, that's for them. That's for everybody else.
So,
That one's my personal one.
but do I need to speak into it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
So, welcome to the U.S.
Thank you.
Welcome back.
Thank you.
You've been here before. I've been to the Strand many times as a customer. It's a great old bookstore, and I've been coming here for many years to buy books. Did a function here a few years ago. I can't recall what it was, but it was a great success. And Ian and I were talking earlier about touring and how much fun it is to be able to tour and primarily to go to great bookstores, independent bookstores. And you're leaving tomorrow for your tour to go west.
Yep, my wife and I will be in Denver tomorrow morning, and we'll be at the Tattered Cupboard. I haven't been there in 20 years now. Then on to San Diego, San Francisco, Seattle, a rest stop in Vancouver. We'll do some hiking, and then Toronto, and then home. So a lightweight tour by
That's pretty light.
by American standards. Yeah.
So how much touring do you do in the UK?
Very little. It's much smaller, as you might have heard, and
And getting smaller, right?
yeah, well, it's
With all of the exiting, you know?
it's breaking apart. I can tell you. That's a whole other story. You can do everything from London, really.
Yeah.
But yeah, I make sorties out to, we've just come from Glasgow and Edinburgh. St Andrews, near Edinburgh. And so far, it's been fun. I mean, it's been events like these rather than heavy media stuff, because I did all that in the UK for the States before we set off. So it's an ideal kind of tour where it's mostly events, just sitting, talking, having conversations like this.
To me, this is a whole lot more fun than going to a bigger venue that's not in the store, where you got to sell tickets and you have maybe 500 people or whatever. Yeah. It's not a rock star tour like Michelle Obama, another writer, but it's just a couple guys like us who sell a few books, so we draw nice crowds. But I'd much rather be in a bookstore with a very intimate setting.
Yeah, I agree. Although sometimes those big events have a kind of edge to them. If there's 2,500 people there, you feel just a little pulse of kind of being on slightly less relaxed, but that could be useful sometimes to be less relaxed. The worst thing, though, is to just when you think you need a glass of red wine at the end of the event, you've got to meet a couple of thousand people who all want a selfie. It is the age of the selfie.
Yeah. Years ago, when I toured a little bit, I would go to the same 5 bookstores in Mississippi. These are 5 friends of mine who helped me with my first novel. And because a lot of stores said no, and so I would pick these 5 stores every year, and we'd go, and the signings would last for a long time. We'd sign a lot of books, and that was gratifying and all that, but I kind of got tired of it. And over time, I stopped doing the signings and didn't really miss that. Then I started again a few years ago to go to see bookstores, to meet. I think it's important for us to get out and meet the fans, meet you guys, meet the people who are buying the books and people who are selling the books. And so that's why I'm touring again. Back to Michelle Obama. I mean, if you're in front of 40,000 people and you're the writer, what are you going to say? I mean, it's kind of like a rock star. The same speech every night?
I have no idea, but I know she did a huge venue in the east of London, the O2, and overwhelmingly the audience was comprised teenage girls of original Caribbean descent, usually from, I don't know how they arranged this, but from fairly disadvantaged schools. And it was like a rock concert. These girls truly inspired. I mean, I have a couple of friends who went and said they were in tears from how motivational, how she stirred them up to be ambitious. And so that's a whole other world from you and me.
The rock star thing?
Yeah. We come out after a year or 2 or 3 of solitude, blinking into the light like moles.
Well, 2 or 3 years for you.
Yeah.
But I'm a bit quicker than
2 or 3 years. I always think of it as more or less a degree course. You find out things, you live with it, all its falls and rises and longers, and moments of what I call hesitation. I never would think of using the term writing block. And the process especially, I don't know how you feel about this, when you hit the last third, when you have learned how to write this book, it won't teach you how to write any other book, any book in the future, but you've learned the language that's appropriate to this book, the characters, the general kind of drift that makes you an expert in this one thing. And that last third, where you know where you're going to end up, for me is one of the real pleasures of writing. Starting is much more a time of hesitation for me, of wondering whether I really want to be doing this, whether I really want to do this degree course and not some other. But once you've passed that line, I reckon, for me, it's usually about 50, 60,000 words. All doubts, you are thoroughly committed, and you know that you're the only person who can write this book, however bad it is. it's yours, and only you can finish it. That's the nicest bit of writing for me.
One thing I admire about your books, and I've been a fan, I guess, since early 90s. What year was Atonement?
2001.
What year was Amsterdam?
90. God, now you got me there.
Yeah. I've written too many too.
Late 90s anyway.
Okay. What I admire is your efficiency with words and plot, but also the length of your manuscripts. You don't turn in thick books. You don't turn in big books. And once you reach a certain level where we are, you can write anything you want to write. You can write as much as you want to write. And the temptation is that no one's going to tell us, cut it. No one's going to say, okay, you have a limit, a word limit. No one's going to tell us how long the book can be. And because of that freedom, so many popular authors say way too much, use far too many words, and they're hard to read. But you have not succumbed to that temptation.
Well, there's a literary form I adore, and that is the novella. And some of my favorite works of fiction are in that form. And it seems to, when we think of the great writers like Thomas Mann, Kafka, Conrad, Henry James, they've all performed beautifully in the form of, say, less than 40,000 words. It places special demands on a writer. The rapidity of establishing things, running maybe 2 subplots rather than 10. So that's one half of my writing career has been attending to those. It's a service to the reader too, because you can read a novella in 1 or 2 sittings, and it's probably the only time in a first reading when you could actually appreciate the architecture of a novel. You don't get the feel of the structure of a novel of great length until the second reading, my feeling is. Then the other half for me is writing at about somewhere between 95 and 130,000 words. So that's about 320 pages, somewhere around there. And my habits are really to reduce, to pare away. My second drafts are shorter than my first, and the third shorter than the second. There's a kind of ghost that sits on my shoulder constantly scowling and saying, you don't need that, you're never going to get away with that, come on, come off it. So I like economy in that sense.
So the first draft is going to be 125 or so. Mm-hmm. The second draft is not a complete rewrite, but a pretty serious cut down to, 100?
Not that much. You'd probably lose 5,000 or 10,000 words a draft, yeah.
The third draft? No wonder it takes you 3 years to write a book. You write it 3 times.
If I wrote the 6th draft first, I could do it in 6 months. But
that's what I do.
Yeah.
So for Machines, your latest, what was the final word count?
It comes out about 9,800, just about the 100,000 words. It's funny, if you go to, when you say 100,000 words in Europe, they go by characters, and 100,000 words means nothing to people. And when they say characters, they also mean the spaces between words too. So I might get an email from a French newspaper saying, "Will you write a book? Will you write something with 7,000 characters?" Now, even you have not written a novel of 7,000 characters.
Or a first chapter, yeah.
Yeah, that's a lot of characters to keep hold of. So yeah, I think Machines Like Me comes out around about 100,000. Mm.
That's amazing, because when I read the book, 100,000 is my goal every time. And my books are a little bit thicker than yours. I don't say it as a matter of pride. I'd love to cut out a lot of it. And I'm constantly cutting, but I would say your books are less than 100,000 words. I mean, are you conscious of words? I never counted words until I got this software that counts it for you. In the bottom left-hand corner, you always know how many words you have in your novel. And after 8 years of that, you kind of keep up with where you are.
Yeah.
I always counted pages.
Sometimes in the middle of a novel, you need a sense of progress, and all you've got is that word count. But sometimes the very first thing I write about a novel that's still a hazy set of disconnected thoughts is something like 8 by 10. I know I'm going to have 10 chapters of roughly 8,000 words. That's one of the first things I do. And it's amazing how it's self-fulfilling. One writes to that pattern. So, for example, when I wrote on Chesil Beach, I just had down 5 by 8. It's a short novel, 8,000 words. And that shapes the rhythm of each chapter and gives me that sense of the structure, which I think is a great service to a reader, that sense of what shape a book takes. Which, as I say, it's really hard, and you can't get the shape of Anna Karenina until you've read it 2 or 3 times. But if you read The Heart of Darkness or Death in Venice, that shape is right there for you immediately.
So you are, by the way, your chapters are far too long in Machines. I come back to page 30 and I said, well, we're finally at the end of a chapter. It's about time. So do you use chapter breaks to build suspense, to keep it going?
Sure. But within the chapter, I use double paragraph space with a little marker, a little asterisk in the printed version. So these are sub-chapters.
Right.
So really, a novel like this breaks down into units of 3,000 or 4,000 words.
4,000?
3,000 or 4,000. So I feel that's a good reading block, 20 minutes maybe, and a chapter would be 3 of those. But it varies, obviously with each novel. But those structures are, to me, extremely important.
Yeah, yes, I agree. But, I worry about... I've been accused of everything, okay? Cranking out formulas and whatever, and so I always worry about how long the chapter should be, how much dialogue to use, when to do the breaks, because you want... my books are obviously... it's suspense, so the pace is faster. You spend a lot more time with things that you like to explore, and that's what we love about your books, because you have this curiosity that is endless. Okay, so you can take your time, stop, and explore music, food, whatever, travel, and you do that, and you do it beautifully. I get bored with that.
You like to keep moving forward.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so when I start writing, if I'm writing suspense, I have a good outline of where I'm going, and I know what the ending is, which is my question to you. I was in Toronto 2 months ago with John Irving, and he supposedly said that he writes the last sentence before he writes the first. Well, I'm not that smart, but I do know the last scene before I write the first scene. What's your process?
I generally know where I'm heading, and I know, more or less what that last scene will be. And in this case, in this novel, I knew that my narrator would end up in a crucial confrontation with Alan Turing, the great computer scientist and codebreaker of the Second World War. But generally, my feeling about novels as a form is that it's a kind of journey, and I know where I'm heading, but I don't know what's going to happen along the way. And the thing I hope for are surprises, that I'll know something at midday that I didn't know at 9 in the morning, and that along the way there'll be a pursuit of what I think of as freedom. For example, in this novel, I send my character on a walk. He leaves the house. I used to live in this area where the novel is set way back in my 20s. And he goes to walk on a big flat park called Clapham Common. And I just wanted him to get away from the scene. He's unwrapped his robot, has come to live and take part in his life, fall in love with his girlfriend. He wants to leave the house. He crosses that common. And as he crossed it, I suddenly had a memory of when I was walking in that same common. And I think this has happened to quite a lot of people. There was a little children's park, and there was a mother there, clearly of very reduced circumstances. And she was giving a very hearty beating to a child who was really young, I mean a toddler. There's a special ring of protection that goes around parents. So to jump inside that ring, really, you draw breath. I drew breath before. The next thing I knew, I climbed over this very low fence around this swing park. And even though my own voice sounded stupid in my ears, I said, "Excuse me, excuse me."
Stop beating your child.
Yeah. In effect, I said, "You cannot possibly treat a child like that." And she let loose an incredible string of invective, and then she stormed away. So suddenly, I thought, I have to have this scene. So I wrote it slightly differently. In this case, I inserted a father of the child and a face-off. But there it was. It was late in the morning. I thought, I need this child. This child is going to play a crucial part of the novel. It opens out an extraordinary opportunity for me, because any robot is going to be completely baffled by the colossal learning capacities of a 4-year-old child. So I aged the child up a bit. I wanted him to have full language. And indeed, I didn't even then know exactly what I was going to use that child for, but I knew that at some scene, a few chapters later, he would stumble into the story. And that's what I mean about the surprises. You know where you're heading, but along the way, you're looking for opportunities to feed into the process. And I think that's one of the... I don't think writers talk enough about the pleasures of writing a novel. They talk about their struggles. It's worth saying that the pleasure principle is a very powerful motivating force. For you too?
Yeah, back to that scene. It's one of my favorite scenes in the book, when he sticks his nose into another family's business. The mother is spanking the child too much. He tells her to stop. She unloads with, the language, and looks up, and here comes the father, who's a guy you don't want to mess with. He's a big burly guy, and they go back and forth, and the father finally says, do you want to raise this child? Do you want this kid? Take him. And our hero says, okay, and he took the child.
Yeah, he calls his bluff. But then, to his immense relief, after they've gone about 10 steps, he's already thinking, what am I doing, leading this child by the hand? My life for the next, I always say the first 55 years are the hardest in child raising. To his immense relief, the mother is running at him and takes a swing at him and takes the child back. But that's not the end of the child, and he will play a crucial part, because an artificial consciousness might have some difficulty understanding a child at play, or the nature of dance, or the enviable speed with which a child with a blossoming general intelligence can learn. I mean, even with deep learning, there's nothing quite so miraculous as a child blossoming into language. And so you're a grandparent, so you know all about this.
So now we're in the novel, which I was trying to put off for a while. It's about a robot, an android, and all about artificial intelligence. And our hero, our robot Adam, is purchased by Charlie and comes to live with Charlie and basically his girlfriend Miranda. Miranda. The other girl's Miriam.
Yeah. Miranda. She's called Miranda.
Right. I got those names confused, which is something you need to watch for in the future. Is not. So why in the where did this idea come from?
Well,
You've always had a fascination for AI,
yeah.
and you've written about it before.
Yeah.
Was it just time to write this novel?
It was, in a way, because AI, ever since the late 40s, when Alan Turing, remember that Alan Turing committed suicide in 1954, so for the purposes of this novel, he lives on.
Which is not the only screw-up with history that you put in this book.
There are many screw-ups with history.
Manipulations.
But I thought I'd import into this one of the oldest plots, which is a three-cornered love affair. So Adam falls in love with Miranda, who lives upstairs. These are very cheap, low rent apartments in South London. And they have what my friend Christopher Hitchens used to call a night of shame, Adam and Miranda. And it's all heard through the very thin floor by Charlie, the narrator. And the reason I wrote that scene is because I wanted the row afterwards. The row afterwards is the crucial discussion, because Charlie has no right to feel betrayed if Adam is just a machine. If he's just a kind of bipedal vibrator, as Miranda points out to him that he is, then he's not a cuckold. If we're going to grant to this realistic human sentience, a subjective life, a consciousness, then he has every right to feel that he's been betrayed. And that, even as he's having that argument, he's rather proud that he's having the most modern conversation conceivable. He might be the first man to be cuckolded by an artificial man.
A robot.
Yeah. So that row was something I didn't even want to plan it until I got into it. Sometimes there are dialogue scenes. Do you find this? You just want to write them without notes, without pre-planning, just to see where they will go. So this was important. And in fact, that row is interrupted by the arrival of that child that I spoke of.
Yeah. One thing you've always done with your books is explore in detail different things that obviously fascinate you, whether it's music. We have music in this book. The Beatles are reunited in 1982. Again, the history's all screwed up. It's a mess. But anyway,
you might wish they weren't united. They make a terrible album from my point of view.
The reunion album was terrible. You write about one of my favorite scenes in the Children Act, when the judge goes to the hospital to visit the patient, and he has a violin, and he starts playing a song, and she sings with him in the hospital room. It's a beautiful scene. I love the scene in Saturday, one of the early scenes, where our hero, I can't remember his name, is talking about to his teenage son about jazz and jazz guitar.
Yeah.
And I think also it was in Amsterdam, where one of our main characters was writing a symphony. But you really know music. Where does that come from?
Well, I love it. I'm not a great player of it. I used to play the classical flute, and that fell away. I could never get my tone.
Good career change, by the way.
Yeah. So I gave up my day job as a flautist. I guess it's just part of the fabric of my existence. I can't keep it out. It's dangerous, I think, because what you might think is the most earth-shattering, beautiful piece of music, to your reader it might not have the same significance. So trying to use music as a sort of an instant button for an emotional response from your reader is a huge mistake. So you mentioned further back on Chesil Beach, young man who loves rock and roll. It's 1962, and it's the music of Chuck Berry that he adores. Whereas he's married a young woman who is a first violinist in a classical string quartet. They try hard to understand each other's music. For him, classical music just sounds like so much, as he says, prim agitation. And for her, she listens to Chuck Berry, and she cannot understand why a song that's in simple 4/4 rhythm needs a drum to beat out the time. It just seems childishly stupid. And that mutual comprehension is really part of the problems of a marriage that's only going to last 6 hours. So I like the music to be, I use this in a pun intended, I use the music instrumentally. It's got to have some function. It's got to be somehow in the warp and woof of a character. Because I know that music that you might love will mean nothing to me, and vice versa.
Another topic that you handle very deftly and beautifully, and I think you secretly really enjoy this, is how should we say domestic incivilities, problems in a marriage. You really know how to describe that. I think back to the opening scene of the Children Act, when the judge is, having a confrontation with her husband of many years, and he's really ticked off because they haven't been, doing much in the bed, and they have no children, and he wants to have an affair with a 28-year-old girl in his office, and he asks her if he can do that. That scene terrified me because I could just see myself asking my wife that, and it would still scare me.
Yeah, the problem of turning your own novels into screenplays, when you say this guy, I see Stanley Tucci, and I've sort of half forgotten the novel, or they've blended my screenplay and the. But yeah, I think that the novelists through the last 2 or 3 centuries have made the marital or the affair or the love affair really the field of play of human relationships. In other words, it's a microcosm in which we can examine up close the close relationship. And of course, being novelists, we're interested in things going wrong. I mean, in Anna Karenina, which I've mentioned before, there are 175 pages of marital bliss, Levin and Kitty, and that's probably the longest stretch of marital happiness in fiction. And it's only Tolstoy's genius that makes it so interesting. And we know also, as soon as a visitor arrives, things go a bit awry. So novelists are drawn to human misunderstanding, conflicts, and the love affair, the marriage, is an arena, I think, for examining the turf, as it were, of things that go wrong, not only between man and wife, but between nations. I mean, in other words, it's the perfect sort of small place to look at the detail of how difficult it is sometimes to understand each other. So yeah, I think that from Homer onwards, do you remember when Odysseus comes home after being away for so long, and of course he's not looking quite as young and spruce as he did when he left Ithaca, and Penelope doesn't recognize him, and he gets in a sulk, and she sets him that famous test of the wedding bed, and they have a marital tiff. And this is a marital tiff that's 2,700 years old, and its civilization is entirely remote from ours, no technology at all. Its manners and customs so completely different from ours, and yet we can understand. When Penelope begs forgiveness, she said, "Please forgive me, I didn't know who you were, I thought you might be just one more suitor." And they finally make it up. And he's grumpy, but he comes around. And I think whenever I read that scene, I think how marvelous that human nature itself is a constant through cultural change, civilizational change.
And those tiffs are so much fun to write about because when you actually see one, which is not very often, when you see a couple having a serious problem, obviously in public because you witness it, you feel like sort of a voyeur. You're watching people like almost like having sex. They're fighting in public, and nobody ever does that, but it's really fascinating.
Yeah. The trick that Charlie learns in having this row, and he says it's taken him years to learn, when you're having a marital row, you don't necessarily respond to the last thing said. And if you're asked a loud, aggressive, rhetorical question, you're a fool to answer it. What you must do is shift ground, what he calls a knight's move. And he said, it's a technique that men are slow to learn, actually. They think that there's a question, you ought to answer it and then come back, but on the same terms. But you need to constantly, in a marital row, shift your ground, be agile. I was hopeless at it.
Not from experience, though, right?
Yeah.
So let me get this straight. In this book, it's 1982. The Beatles have reunited. Lennon is alive. John Lennon's alive. They produced an album that's not very well received. The Falklands Island War happens in 1982, and the British lose to the Argentinians. Because of this, Thatcher is embarrassed, humiliated, and she's defeated. The A-bomb was never dropped by the Americans on Japan. Kennedy survived the assassination attempt. Alan Turing is alive and leading the computer revolution. Okay. Why did you want to screw around so much with history?
It's so tempting, and it was all I could do to keep this in the background. I thought, I'm having too much fun, too much mischief here, and I did pare it back to come back to your earlier question. I've often thought that the present, the one we're in now, is one of the most improbable, unpredictable, unforeseeable constructs you can imagine. And there are so many small things that could have led to different outcomes. You could have a different president. We could leave the EU or not leave it. And 10 years down the line, the present we're in is overwhelmingly self-evident. But the future, we're so hopeless at predicting the future that we collectively make. We didn't predict the internet. We didn't even predict cell phones or the effect that the two together might have on our lives. Even when we had everything together in the late 90s for the internet, we didn't dream of social media. And when we did, we thought it would be liberating. It would bring us citizen journalism. We never thought of the dark side where hostile nations might interfere in the democratic processes of other nations. So it's just small chances that Britain actually managed to get the Falkland Islands back off the Argentinians. Sending a navy, a military force, 8,000 miles to the South Atlantic, very, very dodgy. And if the Argentinians had just found the French engineers who could have primed their air-to-ship missiles, that task force would have been sitting ducks. Our political realities would have been massively transformed. Mrs. Thatcher would not have lasted. The upside of that, of course, is the Argentinian fascist junta rapidly fell apart, and Argentina became a democracy. Christopher Hitchens, I must mention him again, was my only friend who was for this invasion. He came from a military family like I did, but he was always up for a fight, as we know, to our cost in Iraq.
The British love war almost as much as we do.
Yeah. No, we used to think we were quite good at it. But the tiny little pivots that could send us into a different political, social reality. And I've often thought how extraordinary and by chance, what strange chance it was that the Industrial Revolution should take place in the North Midlands in England in the 18th century. It could easily have been in China or somewhere else in another century. And so the technology we have at any given time was never foreordained. That we are where we are with what we've got is impossible to predict, would have been impossible to predict, and could so easily have been other. So even though an atom is a completely impossible thing for us to have now, when we don't even have a decent battery to run a robot, let alone equate the human brain, 100 billion neurons, roughly 7,000 axons on average to each neuron, the whole thing liquid-cooled, sitting inside a liter, never overheats, runs on 25 watts, like a very dim, one of those light bulbs. We're so far from that now, so let alone 1982. But still, that technology AI is now beginning to invade our lives. We just got our finger on the top of this pie, and we're just beginning to press. And again, we can't stop ourselves. Even if we wanted to in the United States, it would be done in China or somewhere else. And whole economies are going to be organized by it. We're about to fill our streets with autonomous automobiles. We're already discussing to what extent they should favor drivers over pedestrians. In other words, we're just on the edge of handing over ethical decisions to a computer in an emergency. That's a very, very big step for us to take. And I like to think that dotted around the campuses of the United States are philosophers who will suddenly be sitting around the table, as I read this is happening, with car manufacturers. Moral philosophers telling car manufacturers how to make decisions on our behalf via computers. We've already had 2 terrible accidents, confrontations with AI, 10,000 meters above the ground with the Boeing 737 MAX 8s. There's a brain that decides, like HAL in 2001, that makes a decision that the plane is stalling when it's not. A 5-year-old could tell you, it's looking out the window, tell you it's not stalling. That brain decided it was, and almost 400 people have lost their lives in an early confrontation with AI. So it's really on us now. Nowhere near, a creature like Adam, but in mainframes, laptops, even in the things we carry around with us, AI is already functioning in our lives. It's going to be huge, I think, civilizational, as it were. And we're going to face people being put out of work. That's already happening. Which is why I have one of my politicians in the novel say, we're going to have to start taxing robots. They're going to have to start paying for the workers they displace. And taxing robots means taxing their owners, of course. And it's going to be enormous. White-collar jobs, doctors, lawyers even, as well as manual jobs will start to disappear. And should we then just have a universal wage? Or should we face the social unrest of having 30%, 40% of the population unemployed? It's a big decision. It's really moving towards us, and there's no dodging it. We can't escape our own ingenuity. But whether we flounder in the face of it is a kind of open question.
Do you, obviously you're publishing now, touring now. Do you have an idea for the next book? Or do you take some time off, or do you?
Yeah, I'm very good at not writing. I'm better at not writing even than writing. So my head is empty. I had 2 or 3 hours to myself yesterday in front of a blank sheet. And I thought, actually, all I want to do is read a novel, someone else's book, and I read a lot of non-fiction. So I'm in that receptive state, and I rather like that. I just need to become a slightly different person before something begins to well up.
So they're waving at me that we need to turn it over to the audience and to you guys. If you have any questions, raise your hand. Well, I'll repeat the question. Yes, sir, right here.
In Imitation Game and in...
Do you want this?
No, that's okay. In Imitation Game and in Machines Like Me, Alan Turing plays a prominent role. Can you recall when you first began to focus on Alan Turing? Because he's a rather unusual hero for most people.
The question is about Alan Turing, and when did Ian begin to first focus on Alan Turing?
So I wrote a film, a drama called The Imitation Game, a title drawn from Alan Turing, not to be confused with a recent movie of that name, in the late 70s. And in it had conversations about whether a machine could think. So the reason then was all of that information about Turing's code breaking had just been declassified. It was official secrets up until the mid-70s. I think his life is extraordinary because he, unusually for a 20th century scientist, was a polymath. He had deep interest in biology, His mathematical understanding was extremely good. He had an enduring interest in quantum mechanics, which I think he would have addressed a great deal. He was very interested in Paul Dirac, who was a very famous mathematician, physicist. And he probably did more than any single person to shorten the Second World War. And the huge irony of that is the state that he served then persecuted him for being gay, offered him the choice of either pleading guilty and going to prison or accepting chemical castration. He chose the latter largely out of curiosity, strangely. But it led finally to depression and suicide. And as I said earlier, he died in 1954 eating an apple injected with cyanide. It has the ring of almost of a Greek tragedy that a man the state all of us owed so much to should then have been persecuted by the state under its rather, to us now, crude, primitive laws of the time. So I wanted to revive him. I wanted to give him the life he might have had and make him a sort of, as I say, at some point, even more famous than Stephen Hawking, or almost as famous as Stephen Hawking. A public intellectual, a fighter for gay rights, joined in the battle in the early days of AIDS, financed a hospice, and crucially abolished the magazines of science like Nature and Science by putting all his work into open source on the internet, and became a hero of that as well, and the voice really of the digital age. And to come back to John's question about did I know the ending, I knew that at some point Turing would meet my narrator and deliver a terrible curse on him for something that he has done. And the question really was, if you buy an artificial human being with a consciousness, can you be said to own a consciousness? If we take having a consciousness as an irreducible good in itself, what would it mean to own someone else's? So if you buy a robot, are you allowed to kill it? And Turing had in my novel at least, my Turing has very, very firm ideas that you absolutely cannot. And thinking into the future, the distant future, we might get to the point where we have to grant rights and responsibilities to conscious beings if they're going to live alongside us.
Yes, sir.
Your ambition as a writer, thank you, has long been evident. And, I've been reading your work for a long time, and the work that you've done in recent years is very different from the fiction that you wrote in the early days in the 1970s when you were known as Ian McCabe. And, I've sometimes wondered whether the title of your most famous novel, Atonement, suggests that novel was perhaps an effort to atone for early work that literary critics might not have been inclined to take very seriously. And so what I'm wondering is, have you consciously repudiated the work that you did, back in the 70s in your short story collections in favor of these very timely novels that have these big global themes?
Well, I don't feel I have anything to atone for. That was the work of young me, and actually, I did come to a point where I didn't feel apologetic about that work, but I just felt I'd written myself into too narrow a corner, and leaving fiction, putting it aside for a while, and writing. I wrote a couple of movies. One was The Imitation Game that I've just been describing. Another one was called The Ploughman's Lunch, which was about the Falklands War and the Suez Crisis. Was a way of stepping aside from these rather overheated, narrow, interestingly perverse, I still think, from my point of view, short stories and short novels. But no, atonement did not refer to my own processes. I can absolutely assure you that I stand by that work. It's still on sale. I still take the royalties. and it would be a terrible thing to repudiate it and still take the money.
Questions? Yes, sir. Yeah, you. Stand up, please.
All right. Yes. The idea of the AI takeover, is obviously really interesting, and I think it poses a lot of questions that may be parallel to the idea of posthumanism. And so I was wondering, would you define this novel posthuman? If so, what does that tell us about our current atmosphere in literature?
There's a moment in the novel when Adam tells Charlie, the narrator, not to get too depressed about artificial humans being cleverer than human. He says, because you too will sooner or later improve your own brains. And already in hospitals around the world, there are people who can move a cursor across a screen because I have a little diode in their motor strip. They just have to think, and the cursor moves one way or the other, which is a fantastic liberation for those who are locked in consciousness. And that almost certainly will extend also in interventions in IVF and sifting through eggs and sperm to improve ourselves. Again, something that we sensibly are very, very careful and regulate a great deal, but other countries are not. And the race will be on. Already there are two scientists in China, I don't know if you followed that, who actually have completely transformed the genome of twins. Whether this represents posthumanism, I don't know. I think that this urge to become God and make a man, make a woman, is a very ancient impulse, very ancient fantasy. You think of Prometheus, who made humans, a very powerful myth. Think of the Argonautica, Jason and the Argonauts, where there is a robot, stands 20 feet tall, hurls boulders at Jason's ship. Think too of one of the most powerful stories of our age, powerful myths, and that is of Genesis, of a benevolent God shaping two beings. And then, of course, the great modern text is Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. I think these all stand right in the heart of humanism. The Shelley story warns us, because Dr. Frankenstein's monster becomes a murderer. That has become our text for the dangers of technology. So I think posthumanism, I think our own values are going to change slowly with the process, that we will accept artificial consciousnesses into our lives, and we will be changed as much as them, and they will force on us a reflection of what it is to be human. So I'm reluctant about these terms because they all devolve around human ingenuity, and actually will emphasize the problems of humanism.
One more? We have time for one more? Yes, ma'am.
This is the asking.
I just wonder is that what did inspire you to portray a pain so beautifully, the life of child, they are innocent. My question is, in future, are you thinking to break through the innocent children? They can be more conscious rather than robot, your new book, because you always inspire us, showing us the innocent, the children, they are the victims. They are so beautifully portrayed by you. Do you have in mind in future they can break through this fighting between artificial intelligence and our conscious mind? Because one child could fight with the artificial intelligence and he could break through. I don't know, you are such a big writer, you may have mind, I don't know. Because we are struggling with in artificial intelligence and conscious mind. And your who couldn't have child figure, very few. And that I think, I don't know, you are a bit lighter than
Okay.
Can you paraphrase the question?
Yeah. So
Because I cannot.
the question, which is actually very lyrically stated, is this: that I have often written about children, and they seem to have. Tell me if this is the wrong word, but they seem to have a redemptive quality. That they have something that, something that we have either lost or forgotten in ourselves, and that there's something of the savior, as it were, in the notion of a child whose innocence is slowly eroded by social reality. Well, I think that's really why there is a child in this novel, because the child is called Mark. Adam, the robot, is frosty towards this child, suspicious, can't quite make out when the little boy, who likes to dress up in, likes to think of himself as a princess, and loves to run up and down the room, flitting about, as he calls it, and dancing. Adam cannot understand this. How we would write the algorithm for a robot who appreciates the nature of a child is a very perplexing question. I mean, maybe we will just rely on deep learning and hope it will just come about of its own. I rather doubt it, actually. I really doubt it. That's why I wanted this little chip of ice in Adam's heart when he contemplates. I mean, there are good evolutionary reasons why children and other mammals play. But those evolutionary descriptions and explanations do not actually catch the full delight of play. And so I think that it's a kind of hint at the limitation of the consciousness that we might make, of what an artificial consciousness might be.
We're out of time. Thank you, Ian. Thank you, folks, for coming tonight. The book is Machines Like Me, and if you haven't read it, buy a copy tonight, okay? And read it. It's a great book.
Thank you very much, John.
Thank you.